Cool. Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for another Transparency Action Hour. Great to see some familiar faces out there, and looks like we've got folks from all over the state today, so that's always awesome. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here with you all. You might know me or you might not. I'm Scotia Hille. I'm the Executive Director of Econ Mass. Really proud to be hosting this with Jonathan Cohn from Progressive Mass, Progressive Dems of Mass, and also Massachusetts Sierra Club, who should be with us very soon. But we'll just get right started. Oh, yeah. Speaking of, there's Jess. Uh, yeah, so we're just going to talk really quickly about kind of where we're at right now, both in the context of our national politics and, why taking action for transparency on our state level is so important. We'll do a tiny little bit of background about the movement for transparency in our state that might be familiar for some folks or new for others. And we will give you a little bit of an overview about where we're at in the process of joint rules, why passing joint rules is so important, and what you can do now about it. And then we will take action together. So thank you all for being here tonight. We're excited to have you. Starting off with context, obviously we are in a situation of crisis in our country, and this is having its impacts, even within our state. And I continually be keeping reminded of a letter that many of you folks within your organizations might have participated in this effort in December, pretty much immediately after Trump's election. Some of us folks in this state knew what it was going to look like on the ground. I mean, and they published their plan for what they were going to do. And we knew it was going to be a crisis. And so we told our state legislature and Governor Hille, please act now, act proactively. We said, here's a quote. I just think it's great. We cannot wait until next January to get started. We ask you to be proactive and not merely reactive to the threats of the Trump administration. Well, how's that been going? Next, yeah. And then one more. So we started off with the week after that. Yeah, one back, I think. The week that Trump started, right after Trump was inaugurated, we had our governor say that, in fact, she was going to cooperate with federal immigration crackdown, going back on a campaign promise. So far, the only substantive legislation that's moved through our legislature was gutting a right to shelter and really cutting protections for immigrants without public input because committees hadn't been made yet. And then our leaders are just really not stepping up to the plate. Ron Mariano, when asked about what the legislature would be doing about the impact of federal funding cuts in Massachusetts, what he could do to prepare for it, he said, quote, "There's not much you can do." And that was a month ago. We have not made much progress on backup plans since then. Just last week, Governor Hille was refused to offer specifics about what contingency plans that Massachusetts had in place. No details on a backup plan. And Karen Spilka, this last quote here was quoted saying, it's difficult to create a plan or know how to respond other than outrage and urging all residents to contact the federal delegation, which, I don't have to point out is really just an abdication of responsibility, that our state leaders, are now 3 months into the legislative session, 2 months into the Trump administration, 5 months into knowing that Trump would be in office, have little to offer us other than get angry and call Ed Markey. So it's not exactly bold leadership from our Democratic leaders in our state. Next. So obviously we're seeing, a lack of sense of urgency. We're on March 25th. Is it March 26th now? And the public is reeling. We're seeing people taken off our streets, members of our immigrant communities targeted. Some of the academic institutions in our state have had funding hiring freezes, are rescinding applications, and yet our legislature has not yet agreed on joint rules. Most hearings have not been scheduled. They have not taken up a non-budget bill, and no one has announced contingency plans for lost federal funding. Which is a pretty dismal state to be 3 months into the legislative session. next. We know that the legislature ignoring progressive priorities is more par for the course than anomaly, unfortunately, that our state house frequently fails its constituents by delaying a lot of the no-brainer, popular, needed legislation, like some of the bills on the right. Some of these would be really critical to what we're facing right now in this federal crisis. A lot of folks are expecting to lose healthcare because of cuts to Medicaid at the federal level. Having Medicare for all in place would be the most basic protection against that. Also, the Safe Communities Act, which was originally introduced during the first Trump administration to protect our vulnerable communities against federal crackdown on immigration. And the legislature has failed to act on this, and we have not seen a sense of urgency at passing any of these bills since then. So that's where we're at. Next slide. Takeaway. The legislature is clearly detached from its progressive population and really not rising to the challenge of what we're facing on the national level. And this is important. This has really serious implications on both the advocacy that we do in our state and the position that we hold within our country. And to talk about this a little bit more, I'm going to pass it to Jess from Sierra Club.
Hey folks, it's great to be with you. So I just want to shed a little bit of light into like why does process matter, right? Process, it feels boring sometimes. Like, why is it so important? So from an advocate's perspective, right, it's really important to be able to understand both how you can influence as an advocate and as just a regular citizen, how you're able to influence the legislative process. That's like part of our democracy, right? And on the other side of that, it's also really important to understand how your legislator is, what your legislator is supporting, how they are representing you, so that you can see, do they represent your values? Are they doing the things you want them to do? That is how democracy works. That is how it's supposed to work. That is how accountability is supposed to work. And for too long in the Massachusetts state legislature, this has not been the norm. So, from everything from making the process harder to access, like, for example, scheduling hearings at the very last minute, and then how can a regular person who works get to a hearing on only a couple of days' notice if they want to testify on something that's important to them, right? So, not having accessible hearings and not giving that advance notice, right? To then the next stage of the process being like knowing what the hearings are actually, like the testimony that's actually being given, right? Like a lot of these things are heard both orally and they're put in writing to the committee. And how do we know what's being said to the committee? This is not public. This should be public. And then finally, and to me, the most important thing, and there's so many different issues, but these are just ones I want to highlight that have like directly impacted advocates at Sierra Club. And the final thing is understanding how people vote in committees, right? This is the one time that there is a substantive vote that is taken in the legislature by your representative, because oftentimes what reaches the very end of the process is already decided on. And so when those committees vote, you want to know what are the legislators supporting. I mean, I can tell you so many stories about legislators who have told advocates that they're supportive, chairs of committees who've told advocates that they're supportive of bills, and then somehow magically those bills do not pass through those committees. If you're a leader in a committee and a lot of the other committee members have co-sponsored a bill, why is it not getting through the committee? Well, we don't know because those votes aren't public on the House side in particular, right? And so these rules are really, really important in making our democracy stronger and in pushing forward the things that we want to see pass. And so, you know, I'm really hopeful that something will come out of this because there's been so much anger and so much ire directed toward the state legislature that clearly they felt like they needed to do something, right? And so this is the last piece of it, right? They really have to like get this over the finish line, get those joint rules into place. I'll say the last couple sessions when we haven't had joint rules, it's been an absolute disaster. Last session in our main committee that our bills go to, the chairs couldn't agree on rules, so they just held totally separate hearings, and everyone had to go and testify twice, right? That was because we didn't have any joint rules. They never agreed on rules. And if you can't agree on rules, how can you have a fair and democratic process? So just thanks to all the work that everyone here is doing, and let's get this done.
Awesome. Thanks, Jess. And let me bring up the slide deck. Scotia, do you want to do a little bit of the next part, and then I'll take on the rest?
Yes.
Sounds good.
Yeah, and for any folks that this is review, just hang on because we're going to talk about where joint rules is at right now. We're going to take action together. We just want to make sure everyone's on the same page about why this is important and how it's connected to the crisis that we're facing at the federal level. In order to respond to crisis of democracy, constitutional crisis, we need to have a strong homegrown democracy. That starts with having relationships of accountability with the reps that we have the most impact over.
Mhm.
And we've seen the results of this growing movement for state house reform, growing awareness of the problems in the state legislature. For me, it goes back to the People's House campaign in 2021. I know that there have been folks that have been advocating for this for even longer, but that was a real moment when state house transparency took hold in the public attention. We had transparency ballot questions win in 37 districts. Now we know 87% of Massachusetts voters on average support public committee votes. I don't have to tell you guys. Question one won every single state in the Commonwealth, demonstrating that no matter whether it's a red or blue district, no matter the socioeconomic status of it, citizens care about knowing how our legislators vote, knowing what they're doing with taxpayer money. And clearly that's having a resonant impact. I can also credit some competitive primaries that we saw last year that I think scared some folks in the halls of power. And we're seeing the result of that. Next slide, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah. The powers that be are forced to pay attention. Mass leaders started this session saying that they want to improve transparency. And I will bring our attention to the next word, efficiency, considering the fact that we're now 3 months into the session and they have yet to pass a substantive bill. So Speaker Mariano let's quote him back to him. He said, "It's our responsibility to ensure that voters feel
Mhm.
they have an efficient and transparent legislature that is responsive to their concerns." Well, I don't know how you guys are feeling, but I'm pretty concerned recently, the last couple months, and I have not been hearing a response from the legislature. And like he said, it's their responsibility to deliver on their transparency promises, and to ensure that they're doing so efficiently. And that means that they need to, act yesterday. And I think I'll pass it off to Jonathan now.
Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna read. Great. Let me put myself on spotlight. Okay. Hello again. I can take Scotia off. So when Speaker Ron Mariano, and so actually, hello, Jonathan Cohn, Policy Director, Progressive Mass. Thank you for being here. So back in January, when Speaker Ron Mariano and Senate President Karen Spilka noted about wanting to boost public confidence in public trust in the legislative process, a number of us thought that if they're going to say this, then it should be up to us, the public, to decide what would boost public confidence in the legislative process and to start making some demands of that, of knowing that if the legislature wants to take credit for steps around making a more transparent, accountable, responsive, efficient process, we need to be setting the table for what that discussion looks like. So back in January, 2 months ago, a group of 30 organizations had sent a letter to the State House endorsing a suite of reforms. And the line there is just from that original letter is about how taken together they constitute necessary steps along the path towards the very legislature which the people of Massachusetts have clearly demanded. That voters want to know what their legislators are doing. They want to be more engaged. They're clearly worried about all like the disaster happening on the federal level and want our legislators to do more and want to know that they are doing more and how they are doing it. So this is just name some of the names organizations a part of it, covered a number of issues and parts of the state, highlighting the broad purchase behind what we were asking for. Okay, so in the context with here, back last month, so in February, the Senate voted on a set of rules and the House voted on a set of rules. And for just as a reminders for folks for how this works, each chamber has to both vote on the rules that govern themselves and the rules that govern the chambers acting jointly. And just to take a step back, as a reminder, when we talk about rules, that can sound abstract, but what that means is the rules are about who has access to what information, right? And that is what are the deadlines by which something needs to be done? What is the timeline on which something needs to be done? All of those, what power is afforded to different people? All of that is determined by a set of rules. It is determined by the Senate for the Senate by itself, for the House by itself, and the two of them together for the committees that they oversee together. So that's why we're talking about, because if we want to control, if we want access to information, that means more people have access to more information. That's at stake. If we want to make sure that we have a more timely, productive, and efficient legislative process that doesn't create bottlenecks, that's at stake. We know that there are so many other things that get in the way of progress, but if we can use one lever that they're talking about to make the system work better, we should take advantage and have the system work better. So, there are some things that they're already done. When the Senate updates its own rules, that is done. The Senate's own rules include publishing the votes of senators in both Senate committees and joint committees. They noted that they've done this for their own committees, but said, you know what? We've been voting for this for several sessions. We don't feel like waiting. We'll just publish the votes from our members on joint committees, again, House and Senate together committees. They also noted that they would make the testimony public when testimony gets submitted to these committees, either Senate or joint committees. And as Jess was noting earlier, if you're working on legislation, you want to know what the other side is saying. They might not always say that directly at a hearing. They might send it in writing so they don't need to publicly own their arguments. But that is helpful to you as you figure out what things you need to push back on. It's also to see who's lined up where on legislation, because sometimes things surprise you. What I always like to point out is that the best rules enable not only, let's say, us as the public, but they enable rank and file legislators to do their own jobs, which some of them don't want to do, but we want them to do. The Senate also voted in its own rules to publish summaries of bills voted on in committee. This is something that is already, or if they already will give these kind of summaries to members, but to actually have that made public rather than just live within the committee. And then the House has already done a few things that are just limited to the House. That includes recording and publishing attendance at hearings. That if you've ever gone to a hearing at the State House, you'll know that like so many legislators aren't even there. It's very much so like you have one job and you're not even doing it dynamic. The House had given itself a pat on the back a few sessions ago for having language about roll call votes, about recorded votes in committee, but that language only included publishing dissenting votes and hiding the full spectrum of how people might vote, including whether they voted at all. I remember years ago when talking to a state rep about that, what they noted to me is that the concern from some members was not whether they'd be put on record as voting yes or voting no, but how most of them don't vote at all in committee, which was one of those like, but that's worse type situations, realizing how they're given no time to vote so they don't vote. And so nobody wants to be put on the spot as having not been one of the first people to not vote. And the House for itself also moved up the reporting deadline for bills and established a rolling deadline. So just for context for folks, there's a current deadline in the legislative process that says by February of next year, so February in the second year of the legislative session, every committee, except for the committee on the committee on healthcare financing, but every other committee needs to take action on every bill in its purview. Meaning that means that they can give it a favorable report, sending it out, They can give it an adverse report, killing it. They could send it to study, which is a polite way of killing it. Or they could just give it an extension and saying it lives another day, but it's not advancing to the next step. The House says both the House in its own rule said, let's move this deadline up to December, and let's also create for our committees acting as themselves a rolling deadline so that there are 60 days after a committee has a hearing, there needs to be a decision. So it's not put off indefinitely. Now to the joint rules, uh, that's what's being debated now, right? So since they each passed their own rules, but for where the House and the Senate are together, the House passed the package, the Senate passed the package, and they need to decide. They have a lot, there are areas of agreement, there are some technical differences, there are some larger differences, and that they're in the midst of negotiating those right now with the first meeting that they held last week to iron out some of those differences. One of the things that's already a foregone conclusion because they both did it with the same language is that the House and Senate committees will now basically be voting out their own bills. The way it works in the Massachusetts legislature now is that these joint committees typically vote to advance legislation as a joint committee, which both House members and Senate members can grumble about for different reasons if they want to see their respective bills advance. And by having both of them are interested in a little like a post-hearing divorce of the two of the committees where they can do hearings together, but then proceed separately. But I put together these couple charts to explain what are they ironing out? What differences are there between what they're both putting forward? And I aligned this with a joint letter that we recently sent, making recommendations for what we want to see in the final set of rules to govern the session. As Jess noted before, currently there is only a requirement that legislators provide 3 days of notice for a hearing. The Senate, for a couple sessions now, has wanted to make that a 5-day notice. We wanted it to be 2 weeks. Frankly, many jobs you need 2 weeks notice for things, so why not give people 2 weeks notice? But 2 weeks isn't up for debate. The debate is between 3 and 5, and we'll take the 5 over that. There's also some differences in language around while both the House and the Senate supported steps about making testimony more available to the public and making posting committee votes, there are discrepancies in the language that we want, and we wanted to make sure that the best language prevails. That includes making sure that testimony isn't just treated like a public record that you have to request to see, but made available more readily in the way that certain other states already do, like our neighbors in Maine, where you can easily access it rather than having to request something, wait a time period, etc. We know, as you own it for information, if things are readily available, people will access them more. If they're not readily available, people will not use them, see them, or take avail. Both chambers included language about making committee votes public. As Jess and Scotia both noted before, people want to know how their legislators are voting. Wild concept. Something that a majority of state legislatures already do. And it's something that the Senate has advocated for a number of sessions that the House has pushed back on. We also want to make sure that the best language prevails here, where the Senate language is much clearer about making sure that everything does actually get a vote. Things like the study orders, when the legislature votes on sending bills to study as opposed to voting them out or down. Making sure that the recorded votes also are not just in-person votes, because those votes never happen. They all happen over email. So we want to make sure that we don't get promised votes that we never get. We don't get promised the records of votes that they never end up publishing, right? However, to the House's credit, the House also has some timeliness where they noted that votes would be published within 48 hours rather than no actual such stipulation in the Senate. One thing that the House included that we liked was that giving members a redlined version of a bill before having to vote on it in committee. If you think about this, if you worked on a bill and you know what a bill, have a rough idea of what it looked like at the start, but you know that changes have been made to it, you would probably want to know what those changes were, to make sure you agree with them, to make sure that nobody's just slipped in anything, any like last minute provisions to benefit somebody, uh, whether or just simply snuck in errors when making edits. And that's something that's valuable, and particularly for the simple work of making legislators better able to do their own job, as well as making them actually know what they're voting on, which is something that is not as common as it needs to be in the legislature. They go hand in hand. If we will see how our legislators vote, they should want to know what they are voting on because we will hold them accountable for those votes. Both we had advocated for adopting the Senate's language of an earlier reporting deadline. As I noted, one of the things in being discussed is having an earlier date than February of next year for reporting up bills. But the House and the Senate want to bring that up into this year, so the first year of the session can be about holding hearings about bills, and the next year of the legislative session can be about actually passing bills. And if the debate's between the first Wednesday in December and the third Wednesday in December, let's take the beginning of the month, because I don't know about you, I always assume that nothing ends up happening in the latter half of December when the holiday vortex hits, and I'd rather protect against that. However, we do value the House's language about having a rolling deadline after a hearing, that your knowledge about what's at stake on a bill and the arguments made before you are freshest a few months after a hearing, and it prevents the bottleneck of pushing everything off until the last minute when you say, okay, we have 2 months from this, let's make a decision. It also helps us as advocates to focus attention. It focuses legislators' attention. So rather than trying to explain to people why they should do everything all at once with one deadline, allows for a better rhythm to this section, or to the legislative session. One thing that it's kind of a minor technical thing, but we wanted to make sure that the rules don't end up undermining themselves, right? You can always take steps to make a process work better in ways that end up making it that somehow can make it work worse. And one thing we were concerned about is saying in the House, where in the House rules, if a committee does nothing on a bill, so if they kind of exhaust all of their opportunities for extensions, then a bill is sent to study. And we know, as many of you who've advocated in the past, they love sending bills to study because that means they don't have a position. And we would like them to not have that out. Right? All right. In the Senate's language, if taking no action means you're killing a bill, that's a deterrent from simply taking no action at all, because people don't like seeing their bills voted down. In the Senate's language, the Senate's bill, rules proposal also made it so that the first meeting of a conference committee would be public. A conference committee, for if you're just following this for the first time, is when you have 3 senators and 3 representatives, in each case 2 Democrats and 1 Republican, meeting to negotiate the final details of a bill to resolve any differences. And those committees operate like a black box. Kind of in theory, they're supposed to meet in public, but they never do, even though decades ago they actually did. And so that means that we, the public, really don't know what these people are saying when they're negotiating a bill, whether people's public positions are matching their private positions about things, and how they see the other chamber's priorities and arguments. We had advocated earlier in the session to just make all of these negotiations public. If you follow on the local level, like open meeting law applies to our cities and towns and already makes a lot these discussions public. But one meeting guaranteed to be public is better than no meetings guaranteed to be public. So it's important for that to be included. One thing that was also that's also being negotiated is under the current rules in the legislature, when the House and Senate come to a final agreement, that's called a conference report for a bill. They could file it at 8. If they file it by 8 p.m. tonight, they can have it voted on by 1 p.m. tomorrow. And I don't know about you, but if I got something at about 8 p.m. tonight and it was a 200-page bill, I probably wouldn't be finishing it or knowing everything in it by 1 p.m. tomorrow. Simply for reasons of time and wanting to consult people who know the different areas at stake. The Senate would say you should get at least 1 day to read that. That shouldn't be far out of left field to give people just a little bit of more time to make sure that you're catching any small errors, making sure you understand what you're actually voting on. One thing that we also wanted to push back on in the negotiations about joint rules is normalizing pushing more things past the July 31st end of session. So again, as a context for folks, the formal legislative session started in January, and it will go through July 31st of next year, even though the legislative session itself continues on through the end of the year to the beginning of January of 2027. And last session, we ended up seeing a lot of work on the legislature happen in the summer and fall once everybody was already not attending regularly anymore. And so when all of the big decisions are happening, when most legislators aren't even going into the building, that means fewer people are having an impact on those decisions. And when you have too few people making too many decisions, we just know that you don't get the full input, and they aren't operating from a perspective of accountability and responsiveness. So we also wanted to push back against that. One thing that's also likely to end up in the rules, we didn't take, like, when we had recently made a set of recommendations, we didn't take a position on which version of it, but that both the House and the Senate want to have bill summaries of every bill that comes before a committee published with kind of as part of like a hearing notice that gets out. They differ about who writes it. The Senate wants lead sponsors to write them. The House wants committee staff to write them, in part because committee staff work for the House. We're happy that there's going to be more information about what bills are in, and thought that's on them to duke out. One thing also not in here that I would add, it would be a good thing to see. The House also wants to make the attendance reporting that they'll adopt for themselves as a part of the general practice. So where are we now? Right now, in end of March, heading into April, there's that 6-person conference committee that I noted who are appointed to oversee these negotiations. Those 6 people, 3 in the Senate, Representative Cindy Cream, who represents Newton, who represents Newton, Brookline, Wellesley. You have Senator Joan Lovely of Salem and surrounding towns like Peabody and Beverly, and other parts of the North Shore. Senator Ryan Fatman in Sutton and surrounding areas in Central Mass. And then on the House side, Representative Mike Moran, who represents all parts of Austin and Brighton. Representative Bill Galvin, who represents kind of Canton, Avon, Stoughton. For those of you learning this, there are 2 Bill Galvins in Massachusetts politics. It's shocking to me when I realized that it's not even that common of a name. Bill's a common name. I don't feel like Galvin is. But there are 2 Bill Galvins in Massachusetts politics. You are also, as an aside, different first names. There was also a Representative Markey on the South Coast, so it can often be confusing if you're talking to people there, noting that they just met with Markey, and you realize that it sounds like an entirely different conversation than you expected. And then the Republican side is David Meridian, who represents Grafton and other areas in Central Mass. But Scotia, I'll let you do the action part.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan, for that thorough walkthrough of kind of our recommendations and where we're at in the process. Maybe do we want to just ask for questions first? Does anybody have any questions that we should address about, where we're at in the process? And I know we had a couple in the chat, but if anyone's got another one before we move to action. Any questions?
I'll just name some things in the chat because we're doing the recording. See, Evan noting about that there was a period where there were more white guys named Mike than women of color in the legislature. I can't remember if that's still the case. There was also a period where there were no longer more uh it was no that was no longer the case, but there were still more white guys named David than women of color. So they beat the Mikes, but they needed to beat the Davids. Uh I think the Dans too. So it's there's a long way to go in basic representation in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Shouting out Travis's comment about how most votes take place in joint committees. And yes, exactly. So one of the things that with a change that's likely to happen with House voting on House bills and Senate voting on Senate bills, one of the tensions that has been caused by that is that because there are 160 state reps and 40 state senators, if you have a joint committee, you will by design have more reps than you have senators. And that created a source of tension where senators felt like that their bills weren't advancing from these committees. And frankly, a lot of the reps weren't happy being with the senators either. I see Anne's question in the chat, and like talked about that how they're ironing out these differences, which is that 6-member committee. And one thing I'll note, and this connects to the action point, if you live in the 6 districts, your representative needs to hear from you, and those 6 people should hear from you. But wherever you live in the state, your legislator should be hearing from you about communicating to the people making those negotiations, because they're negotiating on behalf of the full chamber. Those 3 senators are negotiating on behalf of all 40. Those 3 representatives on behalf of all 160, and so they should be representing that collective well.
Yeah.
I see kind of a long thread about how many bills I see a question from Alex about how many bills are stuck in committee. Where we are now, because the committees haven't really done anything yet, that's all of them. But in past sessions, it is still a large number of them. And I know even the last legislative session, it was striking about how many of the bills that they passed were not even substantive bill, like not of large substance, but the few things they did being bloated with home rule petitions for focus on one city or town, things focused on just one person, like what's called a sick leave bank, where you can use like somebody else's sick time if you've run out, or kind of land conveyances of moving like the ownership of state land, or other kind of fairly minor things as opposed to substantive bills, which to the extent that they existed got bundled together in larger and larger packages. That's a great question from Fred about have people contacted their representative in the last month asking what they've been doing. People should. Like many of them aren't spending it co-sponsoring bills, so that they should be doing something. Noting Charlene's comment about gooding to confront state legislators when they hold district forums. If your legislators are holding meetings in your district, it is always go there because you get face-to-face time with them. Okay. I'll pass it back over to Scotia.
Yeah. Oh, just one more thing I wanted to add is that, this timeline that we're having in Massachusetts is really not typical. I think it was, some folks at Act on Mass did a study of all other New England states and found that we took 2 months to make committee assignments. Everyone else did it either before the session starts or in the first week. And, most other states in New England have already passed substantive legislation. Some legislatures have already wrapped up. Utah is like done for their session. So, this complete delay that we have, although we have a full-time legislature, they're not really working full-time for us, especially given the crisis that we're facing. And that is a shame. So I have sent in the chat the action guide, our joint rules recommendations, and a letter urging them to get to work. So what we recommend is that you click on the action guide, which will kind of bring you to a document that has some example scripts and links to all of the resources that we mentioned here. And we want to take just 5 to 10 minutes right now to have everyone call their legislator's office or start writing an email to them, just communicating these concerns. What have you been up to for the last 3 months? I'd like to see some action from you, and hopefully echoing some of the recommendations that we have. You can forward them our letter, let them know that you support these specific provisions. But we want to take this moment to kind of have our voices heard together, let them know that this delay cannot go on, and that we want to hear from them. So if everyone just want to take 5 minutes, go off camera if you want, to contact your legislator's office. I sent in the chat how you can find your legislator. There's a search function. Giving them a call is always kind of the most direct way, but having an email is also great. So let's take 5 minutes now. All right. I don't want to interrupt anyone's phone call. Has everyone had the chance to take action? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, I'm seeing some thumbs up. I'm really glad you mentioned CCTA's meetings, Pete, because I was going to shout you guys out. Just wanted to say for anybody that hasn't heard about the Cambridge Coalition for Transparency and Accountability, for anyone that's a resident of Cambridge or surrounding towns, there's a really great group of citizens that have been organizing, and some of them are on this call tonight. Pete, do you just want to give a little bit of an explanation of what you guys are up to?
Oh yeah, I wasn't really prepared, but basically, we're just a group of so far Cambridge residents that have been um, after the recent election, we've been trying to go around to each of our reps and senators and meet with them and basically push for transparency and push for action on on these sorts of issues that we're discussing today.
Yeah, they've been doing great work holding their reps accountable. So if you're a resident of Cambridge, recommend you joining with them. And if you're not, that is a great model for something that you could organize in your own community. Just getting a group of neighbors together, getting in touch with your legislator and saying, let's have a meeting and asking them some of these hard-hitting questions. You don't have to wait around for them to come to the district. And cannot recommend enough the work that CCTA is doing, if you need any advice for it. Yeah, do we have anything else?
I think this is all that we have. I'm happy to say as a few closing words. Just the continued value of following up with your legislator. So one of the things that happen, it's important to write to them, and it's also important to follow up if you don't hear back from them. One of the things that is often the case is that legislators don't always expect constituents to keep tabs on what they're doing, and it improves your effectiveness as an activist if they know that you will follow up with them, that you want your questions answered, and it's not just like a drop in the bucket and then moving on toward another issue, but that it is something that you actually care about and you want to get responses. Because to get anything done in the legislative process, we need all of us to be contacting our legislators and demanding more of them. As noted in the beginning of this, so many of you, I can only imagine, have been contacting our federal leaders and how they need to step up and do more. We're luckier than other parts of the country here in Massachusetts, but everybody needs to do more with the power that they have, and we need our state officials to do more. And we want them to model what good government looks like, and then we want them to model what bold, effective government looks like. And we know that those go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm. And I would say too that a lot of the action prompted by groups around this federal crisis has demonstrated that, once more, we know calling your reps really makes a difference because they've been begging us to stop doing it. So we
Yeah.
should just be doing it more often. So thank you all for taking action today. I realized that we completely forgot to talk about Sunshine Week,
I
which
know.
this was intended to be in honor of Sunshine Week. But know that, when you were participating in this action today, you're part of a nationwide movement to focus on open government,
Mhm.
and holding our leaders accountable. So we're technically
Yeah.
honoring Sunshine Week, but we forgot to
Exactly.
talk about
Sunshine
it.
Week last week, timed with the spring equinox, something from the News Leaders Association. Forgot about it, but like as we said at the event, like we believe that you should live every week like Sunshine Week. And that's why it's always timely to contact your legislators about these things.
And
So
thank,
I think with that, I'll kind of once again thank everybody for joining us this evening, and I'll close out the recording. And we'll be sending out later. We'll send out the recording to everybody. So if you joined, for those of you who weren't able to make it but RSVP'd, we'll send out the recording and some follow-up steps, and we will keep you posted about what ends up happening.